Maybe you've seen the 1980s classic, Coming to America. In the movie, Prince Akim Jofer is the heir apparent of the fictional country of Zamunda. He is pampered and privileged. However, Akim has grown tired of all the royal treatment, resents never being able to think for himself, so he travels to Queens, New York, where he sees the sights, he rents an apartment, he falls in love, and he also gets a job. He becomes a minimum wage earner at the local burger joint, mopping floors, taking out trash, and doing whatever else needs to be done. He performs these duties with joy and pluck, happy to be in charge of his own life for once. When you think of garbage, he says, think of Akim. Now, when Akim's father, King Jaffe Jofer, finds out where he is, he travels to Queens to retrieve his son. He is enraged to find out what his son has been up to. "My son has a job," he cries. This is not customary, it is not seemly, it is humiliating for the king to imagine. But for Akim, it is what he came to do. He came to America to make himself useful for once. He has no problem taking out the trash that needed taking out. He has no problem mopping floors, they were dirty. In the Gospel of John, chapter 13, we have ourselves a coming to America moment. Jesus, the Son of the Father, has left heaven. He came to earth, to Queens, to live alongside his subjects. He gave up his heavenly regalia, put on a fast food uniform. He did this to show us true humility and servanthood, even washing his disciples' feet as a sign of his eagerness to serve. Not everybody could stomach such a demotion. They were embarrassed at this unseemly display of servanthood by a divine figure. Even some of Jesus' own disciples couldn't stand to look on as the Prince of Creation emptied their trash cans. "God's Son has a job," they exclaimed. But it's what the Prince of Creation came to do. He came to serve, to flip burgers, to take out the trash, to wash feet. He even came to die. And if we really want to be his people and enjoy life forever with him back in Zamunda, it's what he expects of us as well. The story takes place in John chapter 13. We're going to look at the story as the next installment of our series here at Rooftop called "The Hour Is Come, Following Jesus When Your Time Has Arrived." We've been studying the Gospel of John here at Rooftop for the past few weeks. For most of the book, Jesus has been out and about teaching the people about God and showing them God's love and power. Eventually, though, the hour comes for Jesus to head to Jerusalem to do what he came to do. He came to die on the cross for our sins, and he decides the time is right to do that. Before the hour finally arrives for Jesus' sacrifice, though, he does have a few things to do, one of which takes place in John 13. And that's the passage that we're going to be reading and studying together this morning. So if you want, you can follow along in your program from the screens above or in your Bibles if you brought them. John 13, verse 1 through 17. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into the basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, my hands, my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said, "Not every one of you was clean." When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Now, probably you know this story. It's one of the more infamous scenes from Jesus' life. In the scene, Jesus and his disciples have sat down for the evening meal, and in the middle of the meal, Jesus gets up, takes his robe off, begins to wash the feet of his disciples. Back then, this was a necessary act, given that people wore sandals and they had dusty roads. Customarily, a servant would wash the feet of guests before the meal. For unknown reasons, that hadn't happened, so Jesus does it and offers it as a lesson for us in how we are to serve one another. It's a well-known story, well-known passage with a fairly straightforward message. The point is obvious. Jesus came to serve us, so we should serve each other. For once, we aren't digging around trying to figure out what Jesus could possibly mean with what he does and what he says. The point is very obvious here. Jesus came to serve us, so we should serve each other. And yet, even with such a straightforward point, scholars debate this story left and right, and they debate it at all kinds of levels. One of the things, for example, that people like to debate about the story is whether or not Jesus should be taken literally or metaphorically here. In verse 14, he says that now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Is Jesus telling us to literally wash one another's feet? Do you think Jesus is telling us literally to wash one another's feet? A lot of us say no, but all sorts of Christians and denominations think that at the very least we should take Jesus literally here. All sorts of denominations have annual foot washing ceremonies. The Pope washes the dirty feet of a select few every Holy Week. Other Christian denominations have regular foot washing ceremonies. Even a lot of marrying couples perform foot washing ceremonies in their wedding. I don't know if you've ever seen this at a wedding. He's not looking for the garter there. He's washing her feet. People who advocate a literal interpretation say that Jesus is very clear here in what he says. You should wash one another's feet. Why should we not interpret Jesus literally when he tells us very clearly what to do? Because it's gross? Is that why? Now, of course, people who believe that Jesus is speaking metaphorically argue that the reason Jesus washed his disciples' feet is simple. Why did he wash their feet? They were dirty. In our culture, with the blessing of shoes and socks, we don't generally need our feet washed. This is a metaphor for acts of service in general. I've had my feet washed a few times in religious services, and it's always very nice, very moving for some. In the back of my mind, I think this is nice and all, but my feet aren't dirty. If you want to really meet my needs right now, I could use a back rub. I'd much prefer a back rub service than a foot washing service. So anyway, that's an interesting debate about whether or not to take Jesus literally here, but of course it's a distraction because it's not really John's point in telling us the story. John's big point in telling us this story is that if Jesus, who rules over all the universe with the power and authority of God, could do something so menial as to wash his disciples' feet, we, who have no such power or authority, should be willing to do that and more. The author emphasizes the bizarre inappropriateness of Jesus doing this act. In verse 3, he writes, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. Listen to how John writes that. Jesus knew God had given him all authority in heaven and on earth, and that he was from God and going back to God. So he got up, took off his clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and washed their feet. John is setting up an incredible contrast here that Jesus, more powerful than 1,000 Prince Hakims, would do something so menial. And this is what was so shocking to Peter. Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Is this actually happening? My son has a job, King Japhi declared. Princes don't have jobs. Messiahs don't wash feet. But Jesus did. It's what he came to do, and it's what he came to do because it's who he is. Servanthood is at the very center of God's character. In fact, let me show you something from the passage. It's a tiny little word that means an awful lot. John writes that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So, he got up from the meal and washed his disciples' feet. That "so" is a big deal because it expresses consequence and gives reason for the act. I'm a Cardinals fan, so I go to games. I like steak, so I go to Outback. John is explaining that Jesus knew he was God, so he washed feet. I don't want to make too much of this, but I think it's a really big deal. It's a big deal because it's not how many of us think of God. We think of Jesus as the great and powerful God who came to earth to serve in spite of being God. John says that Jesus is the great and powerful God who came to earth to serve because he is God. That's the difference, in spite of versus because of. Did Jesus come to serve in spite of being God or because of being God? John says he knew he was God, so he decided to wash his disciples' feet. He did that because God is by definition a servant. Like I said, this is not our common understanding of God or divinity in general. There's an ancient Greek myth about Zeus and Hermes. The two gods came down to earth to spy on humans, to see if humanity was giving the gods the respect they deserve. In order to avoid detection, Zeus and Hermes clothe themselves as poor servants. Once they find out what they need to know, they throw off their poor garb and return to Mount Olympus in their splendor. The humble poor thing was an act. It reminds me of politicians who pretend to be servants for a day or an hour. Something terrible happens, so the president and the governor put on khaki pants, take along photographers, and go to fill sandbags for a few moments. It's a PR opportunity. They serve in spite of being president or governor. Wasn't that nice of them to give up their time? Then they fly back to Washington to continue their rule, surrounded by all their subordinates. They served in spite of, not because of. I even feel that sometimes around here. Every now and then, I get caught doing something menial. And I always get a good job. Like, isn't it so nice of me to be shedding my pastoral authority, to vacuum up the bagel crumbs? But what else should I be doing? I'm the lead pastor of the church. I don't get any attaboys for doing what Jesus says I, of all people, should be doing. I was taking the trash out a while back. Somebody said, "Look at our pastor serving his flock." That was way too congratulatory for me. A far more biblical comment would have been, "Faster, slave. You forgot the bathrooms." I take out the trash because I am a pastor, because I am a Christian leader, not in spite of being a leader. Jesus served because he was God. He didn't take time off from being God to come serve. It's who he is. And if Jesus is God and God washes feet, then, this is John's next point, how much more us? That's John's other point, that if Jesus is a servant who came to serve, how much more us? Towards the end of the passage, when Jesus has dried off and cleaned up, he looks at the disciples, he explains what he did. You call me teacher, you call me Lord, rightly so, that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. He goes on, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. In other words, I'm your Lord, I'm your teacher, I came to serve, you are my students, my messengers, you are not greater than me. No offense. You are not greater than me, and if I bow down to wash your feet, how much lower should you bow down to wash each other's? And this is where the passage gets very practical, because it is another important call to service from Scripture, that all God's people should be serving as Jesus himself did. As Jesus came to serve us, so we should serve each other. And to be honest, in a certain respect, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. Active service has always been one of our big 6 values. We have really grown as a congregation of servants. Our service team is bustling with people who organize service opportunities at the nursing home, running the food pantry. We had over 100 people show up for Serve St. Louis. We send dozens of people to various corners of the globe. We have people who model complete devotion to their family and neighbors. We have people who sacrifice time and money to sustain God's work. I am preaching to the choir. But we will always struggle against selfishness. And until every single one of us in this congregation is completely devoted to serving others as Jesus served us, this lesson will always be urgent. This sermon will always need to be preached. And with all that in mind, I want to go back and look at Jesus' example for a moment to see what we have to learn from it about servanthood. Jesus says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Like I said, I doubt very seriously that Jesus intends for us to take him completely literally here. The lesson here is to serve as he did, to wash feet. But even if this is a metaphor, the story gives us a good example of how to serve as Jesus did. And with the few minutes I have left, I want to share a few short lessons that we can learn from Jesus' example of servanthood. For example, here's service lesson number 1. Take initiative. One of the things I like about this scene is that Jesus just does it. He doesn't wait for anybody to ask him to wash their feet as though anybody would. He just does it. For whatever reason, no servant had washed their feet. We don't know why. All the disciples are sitting around wondering what to do, who's going to do it. They're avoiding eye contact, shifting awkwardly on their cushions, trying to ignore the odor of their manure-caked feet. Finally, Jesus just gets up and does it. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. Doesn't wait to be asked, he just does it. This is important because a lot of churches in the world in general has a wait to be asked culture. I'll do it if you need me. Call me if you're out of options. Let me know what you need. We have a whole lot of people willing to serve but not so willing that they'll just jump in. There was a guy here at Rooftop years ago. He has since moved on, but one of the things I liked about Larry, his name was Larry, was that he did not wait to be asked to do stuff. One day I showed up to church and he was building a retaining wall, the one out by the mailbox. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm building a retaining wall. The dirt keeps spilling out, and somebody needs to put something here, so I got the stone on discount, just thought I'd do it." Another time I showed up, he was laying down stone pavement, got it on discount, needed to be done, nobody else was doing it, just thought I would. Larry was like 70 years old, too. You might remember Larry. He just did stuff. I know this sort of initiative can cause problems. Maybe we didn't want the stone pavement. There are channels to go through. It'd be different if I had showed up and Larry was painting the sanctuary or remodeling the bathroom. But compared to the wait to be asked mentality that I sometimes encounter, I will take misguided initiative any day of the week. I have a friend named Nate who has a dad. He's the same sort of guy. He just takes initiative. A few years ago, Nate's dad was in a Bible study with some friends. During prayer time, one of his friends told him that he had some friends in Nebraska who were having marriage problems and had separated. Nate's dad asked if they were getting help. The guy said no. Nate's dad asked if anybody was reaching out to them. The guy said not that he knew of. So the next day, Nate's dad drove up to Nebraska and met with this couple that he didn't even know to try to get them back together. I think he saved their marriage. I heard that and I thought, that's crazy. Who would do that? Followers of Christ would. They take initiative. They don't wait to be asked. What are you waiting to be asked to do? What do you see needing to be done and are waiting for somebody else to do it or waiting for somebody to ask you? Have some initiative. Get up, take your robe off, put on the towel, and do what needs to be done. Take initiative. Service lesson number 2 is do whatever. Jesus did whatever. The very reason none of the disciples wanted to wash each other's feet was because it was such a foul job. One commentator that I read this week writes that the task of foot washing was so menial that according to some Jewish sources, Jewish slaves were exempt and the job kept for Gentiles, non-Jews. So not even Jewish slaves had to do this. It was reserved for Gentile dogs like you and I. which makes it all the more remarkable that Jesus did it. He did something so foul that not even Jewish slaves were required to do it. There's a lesson here for us too. In our day and age, we like to serve on our own terms. We like to serve according to our gifts and passions. And generally speaking, that's how it should be done. We don't want people with the gift of prayer in charge of the finances. We don't want people with the gift of testosterone in charge of the women's ministry. Wouldn't work. But many of us use this gift-oriented service mentality as a reason not to do things we don't feel equipped to do. Jesus didn't say, I don't have the gift of foot washing. Somebody else? Philip, you're a foot guy, aren't you? No, he said, look, here is a need that needs to be done. I will do it. I mean, what good would it be? What good would I be at home to Michelle and the kids if I focused exclusively on what I was gifted for? Michelle, here are my gifts. I will paint because I'm good at that, which I am. I will help with math, honors math classes, K through 12. I will write sermons for the children. I will cook hamburger helper because that's a skill of mine. But there are things that I'm not called for. We will outsource these to grandma, to you, or to other more gifted members of our community. Diapers, cleaning, shopping, cooking, dispensing of medicine, the cleaning up of vomit. That is not going to work. To be a Christian is to do what needs to be done. To be honest, I probably feel called and gifted to do about half of what I do here at Rooftop. The other half I do because I know that Jesus would. During boiler rooms, I volunteer to watch the kids in the back because it's hard to get volunteers to do that. I'm not necessarily a kid person, but it needs to be done. One of our old Rooftop friends was a perfect example of this. His name was Paul Seidel. I think his name is still Paul Seidel. But he was a long-timer here who helped to start the church. Now he's actually off in Illinois starting a church over there. And in our early days, we were having our meetings, and we had lots of unfilled needs here and there. Paul came up to me, and he said, Matt, let me be clear. I will do whatever you need me to do, no limitations. Put me wherever. We used him everywhere. He did projection, he did kids, sound, small groups, men's leadership, elders, set up, tear down. Some were in his wheelhouse, some weren't, but he did whatever. He was our Jose Oquendo, wherever we needed him. Played some positions better than others, but he just jumped in. How guarded are you with what you're willing to do? How reluctant are you to do things you don't want to do? Yes, Christianity is about finding and using your gifts. It is also about washing feet. It's about doing whatever. If you want to have a really good morning this morning, here's what I would love to see on any info card. Put me wherever. Put me wherever you need me. Use me wherever you need me. There are dirty feet everywhere around here. We just need somebody to wash them. Take initiative, do whatever. And lastly, service lesson number 3, serve your enemies. One of the interesting things about this passage that gets kind of not noticed all the time is that Jesus washed all his disciples' feet, including whose? Judas, who had already decided to betray him and turn him into the authorities. Jesus already knew this. And when he talks to Peter, he says, you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew he was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. Jesus knew that the man who would turn him over to the Pharisees and then to the Romans was in their midst, but he washed his feet. This is an example for us of the overflowing love of God that would serve anybody no matter how far gone. And it is not easy for us to stomach either. Last spring, Pope Francis, for example, participated in the annual Holy Week foot washing ceremony. Every year, the Pope washes the feet of some locals to show his servanthood and humility is a lesson for all of us. But Francis upset a lot of people because of whose feet he washed. That's right. Among the group of footies that he washed were 2 feet that belonged to a young Serbian Muslim girl. Many traditionalists were incensed, saying this was improper. Jesus would never do this. He washed the feet of his disciples' feet, the feet of his disciples, all of whom were men, not girls, and none of whom were Muslim. I'm going to side with Pope Francis on this one. God's serving love does not discriminate. Jesus washed the feet of the man who was an accomplice in his murder. And we're going to say that Jesus can't wash the feet of a Serbian girl. It is through service that we show God's love to a disbelieving, skeptical world, especially service to our enemies. There's a pastor down in Louisiana who has built a very thriving church and ministry based on this very simple idea. He wrote a book called Servolution. And in the book, he tells of the way that the people in his church have made a difference in their community by serving people in random, radical ways. They have bathroom cleaning brigades that go around to various businesses and establishments and just show up to clean their bathrooms unannounced. They send teams to go stand outside strip joints to give roses to the dancers as they show up for work at night, while other churches are picketing the joints. They're there serving the women with the love of God. We might chuckle at that and think it unseemly, but how is it any more inappropriate than Jesus washing his murderer's feet? Am I saying that this Friday we should head over to Larry Flint's with roses? Maybe. Maybe not all of us should go, though. What I am definitely saying is that if anybody needs to see God's love and servanthood, it is the people we can't stand. It is our neighbors who get on our nerves, our estranged family members, our friends we're in conflict with. What does washing their feet look like for you? Take initiative, do whatever, serve your enemies. That's how Jesus served, how we should too. I know we're going a little long this morning, but can I make one final point? Thank you. I was going to anyway. Wanted to pretend to be courteous. Towards the end of the passage, Jesus tells us something final and important. He says, I have set an example that you should do as I have done for you. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed, period, if you do them. Jesus promises blessing upon blessing for his foot-washing servants who do disgusting acts of service to show God's love to the world. Jesus promises joy and peace and reward and eternal life for his people. But he's very specific about the people he makes these promises to. To whom does he make these promises? To those who do. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. This is important because we have all heard this sermon before. I have preached this sermon before. I have preached on the importance of servanthood, and doesn't it feel good to talk about service? But the kingdom isn't for those who know what to do. The kingdom is for those who do. The kingdom isn't for those who sit and listen politely to sermons on the servanthood of God. The kingdom is for those who take initiative. The kingdom is for those who do whatever. And the kingdom is for those who serve their enemies as Jesus has served us. So I'm done talking. Go do. Let's pray.